Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Totalbiscuit. Let's have a little bit of a fly around, shall we? I've got a lot of footage from Planetside 2, unfortunately no big battles, because hey, nobody was actually playing the Studio Alpha at the time, really. We've got a few little duels here and there, some of which you've seen, but nothing big scale. I'm hoping to get the opportunity to do something like that in the not-so-distant future. So I'll get into my wonky mosquito. Let's have a fly around. I just want to talk about what Planetside actually was for those of you who never played it. That's a hell of a lot of you, unfortunately. So Planetside was essentially the first MMO FPS, and there have been two other games that also kind of hold that title, Neocron being one of them, and World War II Online being the other. Neither of those really met either the scale or the mechanical prowess of the original Planetside. Now, that's not to say that the original Planetside had good game mechanics. In fact, it lacked in many areas. It sacrificed a whole lot of things to actually get that kind of scale back at that time. But it was significantly more functional and more of an FPS than the other two games that I just mentioned. So, essentially, you had a first-person shooter on very, very large maps, larger than any other FPS available at the time. And you also had more people per map than any other FPS at the time. That's perhaps one of the most important things. As of the population limits put in 2005, that game supported 133 players per faction per continent. So that is, needless to say, a grand total of 399 players per map. Now, what does that actually mean in real terms? Is that 133 soldiers on the ground for each faction? Not necessarily. That could mean 133 Reaver pilots. The Reaver one-man gunship that was most often used, kind of in a role. I'm using this mosquito now, as you can see with these rocket pods, to bombard vehicles as well as individual people on the ground. That could represent 66 main battle tanks for the Vanu Sovereignty or the New Conglomerate. The Terran Republic had an optional third seat for a 20mm cannon, if I recall correctly, and that would be 44 Prowler main battle tanks. That could also be 44 three-man Liberator bombers. Or perhaps the most iconic thing of Planetside, that could be 11 fully manned Galaxy dropships. A Galaxy dropship had the capacity to take an entire infantry squad and 2 max units into battle. Could also carry a light vehicle, but we're not really counting that. That's the kind of scale that we're talking about here. We're talking about a dropship that can carry the capacity of an entire FPS team. And you can have like 10 of those on each continent. In fact, you could have more, of course, just not fully crewed. In theory, you could have 133 Galaxy dropships, each crewed by a single person, but that was very unlikely to actually happen. The variety of the vehicles in that game was facilitated by the fact that people had to so-called certify for these vehicles. That was the way the leveling system actually worked. Each time you leveled up, you got a certification point. Certain certifications required more than 1 point. You'd get a certification to fly a certain vehicle or use a certain weapon or armor type, and as you gained more levels, you could just use more of them. You would never become more powerful, which was kind of neat. The certification system in Planetside 2 is currently in a state of being reworked, so I can't really talk too much about that, but expect the same kind of thing with a bit of a more modern-day unlock twist on it. But one way or the other, you will have to somewhat specialize in order to be any good at your role. Now, one of the most important elements of Planetside, as I spawn myself a Vanu Scythe air superiority fighter here to show you how that ends up working. Now, that's a Mozzie, let's try something a bit different. Was the idea that battles were persistent. You could log off, log back in later, and the same fight would be going on, except, of course, it would have progressed. The idea was to capture as many continents as you could. There's no endgame scenario in Planetside. There can't be. The worst-case scenario is that your empire ends up losing every possible base and tower asset on every continent, and you're forced back to the so-called neutral sanctuary area, which allowed you to gather your army and then go and take on another continent, start an invasion. Once you were able to gain a foothold, you could use what was called the Heart Shuttle, which allowed you to drop in from orbit on particular locations. You couldn't do that if you didn't at least have some control on the continent in question. You didn't own some kind of base asset to break the so-called continent lock, which prevented dropping in. So you would either have a little covert ops team that would go in via the warp gate lattice, and they would access the continent and begin a hack. Once they had a base, then people could start dropping in to reinforce them. Or you'd have this rather awe-inspiring rollout, where you'd either have an outfit or an entire empire organized to go and attack a particular continent, and you would see convoys of tanks, transport vehicles, Reaver gunships, Mosquito scout aircraft, galaxies, all rolling through the warp gate in order to assault a location. Which was one of the coolest things I have ever seen, by the way, and no other game has ever replicated that. It's very exciting because you get this huge army force, and you feel like you're part of a gigantic army, which you never really get in any other first-person shooter. I think the closest I could ever say is if you're on a 64-player Battlefield server, in the first 5 seconds where everyone mounts up in vehicles and rolls out. You never get that feeling again. It just doesn't happen. In Planetside, that was a very regular thing, whether or not it be rolling out of Sanctuary to start to take territory again, or whether it be rolling out of a base that you've just captured in order to go and get the next one. Something that you would never get in another game, and here you got the same feeling that you get from a big-scale shooter at the start of the match, only your army is 4 times larger and has a hell of a lot more vehicles and general war assets at its disposal. Now, an awful lot of what went on in Planetside was kind of disorganized. It was called zerging around the place, and it was simply a case of everyone ended up going in one direction, because that's where everyone else was going. It's very much a crowd mentality. But the point of outfit play, outfits being guilds in Planetside, was that these outfits would actually organize using TeamSpeak and Ventrilo, and they would take part in larger special operations. They would actually have a leadership structure. There was an overall leadership structure for your faction. It was called the Command Rank 5s. As you led a squad, you would gain a different kind of experience called Command Experience, and eventually you could raise up all the way to Command Rank 5, which took a hell of a lot of time. That gave you the ability to speak on the global channel to your empire. So, along with your other CR5s, you could attempt to organize and hopefully get the Zerg going in the direction that you wanted to go. Or the more organized CR5s had contacts with various large outfits who were willing to help them out on special operations. So I could tell this outfit to go and capture this base, or disable the power here, or capture these towers, set up AMSs, which were these spawning trucks, essentially. They were fairly vital for getting people where you wanted them to be. If you had no spawn point near the objective, then it was going to be very difficult to deal with. And spawn points either involved capturing a tower, which could be quite tricky. Tower defense was something that people were specialized in that game, as of course was Tower Assault. It was a very enclosed area. It got very, very violent. It was a bit of a bloodbath. And you attempted to hack these smaller towers, which also exist in Planetside 2. Gaining control of a tower would give you an additional spawn location that was generally located somewhere outside of a main facility, so you could start hoofing it over from there. You couldn't spawn vehicles from a tower. There were air towers which you could repair your air vehicles on because they had landing pads, but you couldn't spawn a vehicle from it. Planetside 2 makes a few changes. The AMS has actually gone in the current build, and they've replaced it with the Galaxy, using the Galaxy dropship as both a dropship and a mobile spawn point, depending on how you actually outfit the thing. We didn't need the Zebra Scythe anyway. That's a major change for those of you who used to play the original Planetside. You can't just bail out of a vehicle and expect to land on the ground safely. You can outfit your vehicle with an ejector seat, which allows you to do that, but it's not a default feature. The thing about Planetside 1 is that a lot of vehicles, especially these smaller air vehicles, were just used as throwaway transports. You would get in the vehicle, you would fly to your location, you'd just drop out of the vehicle. It was a good way of getting on top of a tower and attacking it from the top down as opposed to the bottom up, which was generally much better defended. They don't seem to want you to use vehicles as throwaway transports this time around, because vehicles actually cost resources from a pool, so you can't just keep spawning vehicles. Admittedly, there was a cooldown on them in Planetside 1, so you couldn't just keep spawning the same vehicle over and over again if you lost it every minute, but you could essentially just keep spawning vehicles until the end of time, until that base actually ran out of power. Ah, the beamer. Yes. Planetside folks remember the beamer. The beamer was the sidearm for the Vanu sovereignty, and it was jokingly referred to as the flashlight because it had a pathetic weapon sound and it also did barely any damage whatsoever. And it lit you up like a Christmas tree as well, so even as an infiltrator, the stealthy cloaked class, it was a horrible pistol to use, because everyone could see where you were for miles around. Not exactly what I call ideal. Now, in Planetside 1, capturing a base required one of two things. Either you would hack it and then hold it 15 minutes until you gained ownership of it for your faction, or you would hack it and you would have to take what was essentially a flag to another base that was linked to that base via the lattice system. The lattice system was designed so that you couldn't just hack any base that you wanted. You had to hack them in some kind of order. You had a number of choices, because the lattice would often spread out in a kind of web, but you couldn't just go and hack random bases. It was called backhacking, and it was rather annoying to deal with because you never really had a front line back then. So when they put the lattice system in, they designed it so there was a front line that you could fight over. In Planetside 2, they are using a more advanced hex-based system whereby you will take control of areas of the map. You don't even have to take control of a base necessarily. You can take control of small outposts and towers and things like that, which will give you access to the resources available on that part of the map. The main problem with the lattice system is that there wasn't really any fighting between bases unless vehicles kind of clashed, which was kind of rare. Open field warfare didn't happen that much because there was no reason for it to happen. You would drive from one base to the other, maybe there'd be a little skirmish, but most of the fighting would end up around bases, which is not necessarily that interesting. Putting more facilities out in the open, towers, and capture points that are not part of the main base structure is hopefully designed to remedy that, as well as having this hex-based front line whereby you capture territory as opposed to merely facilities. So that's kind of a basic overview of what Planetside was. Big scale, big battles, quite a bit of strategy involved in it when people actually paid attention to such things. You had to organize your army and spread it across the entire of the continent to effectively and efficiently capture it. There have been comparisons made to Battlefield, and it's not an unfair comparison in some of the mechanics. Like, it's a vehicle-based game, and there are capture points. But then that's pretty much the end of it, because there are two big things that completely change the way the game functions in comparison to that. Scale and persistence. That is something that other FPSs simply do not have, and it completely changes the way that you fight. Because battles can be going on for hours and they don't actually end after 20 minutes and then reset the entire map, needless to say, the entire dynamic of the game changes, and there are many game mechanics built around the idea that fighting simply doesn't stop. That's why it's a very unique experience. Those of you who played World of Warcraft back in the day when Alterac Valley was its big scale and fights could go on literally for days, I think you get a small idea of what Planetside was, only it was nowhere near as frustrating. It was awesome to get involved in a battle that would actually last all day as opposed to 20 minutes. It gives you the feeling that you are genuinely part of a war. That's something that other FPS does not give you at all, simply because of the fact that maps just reset and there is no persistence. That's why the idea of an MMO FPS has kind of been the holy grail for many companies for the longest time, but it's never really happened to the satisfaction of everybody. In the case of the original Planetside, they had to sacrifice many shooter mechanics in order to get what they needed out of the game. At this point, what I'm hoping is that Planetside 2 does not sacrifice those mechanics, and by the looks of it, it seems like it's going to be pretty damn solid. I'll be bringing you more coverage as much as I can anyway. We're not entirely out of footage yet. I just want to try and make something reasonable out of it, and then hopefully I'll be able to get access to some kind of either alpha or closed beta once that stuff is available, and bring you the large-scale battles, which is something I could not show you during the studio tour, simply because we did not have enough people there to properly facilitate it. I'm looking forward to showing you more of this game. Planetside was my first MMO love. After all, Planetside 2 is shaping up to be a rekindling of that old flame. I'll see you next time.